When I was 20 years old, I was still a student at North Carolina A&T. I had taken an internship. That internship took me to West Africa. I worked for the Agency for International Development. I was stationed in Ghana, but I took a TDY, temporary duty, in Burkina Faso. It was called Upper Volta at that time. I was actually traveling with the ambassador to Ghana. We were there going to Burkina Faso, and we had to travel. It was almost 500 miles. But we were going to Burkina Faso because there was a drought in all those countries that were north of Ghana. It was the Sahelian drought, and what that means is that the Sahara Desert sometimes creeps south and takes over, and there is a drought, and as a result of the drought, land dries up, crops die, animals die, then people die. We were at the stage where people were dying. And so we were traveling there to see how our American aid was going. The ambassador to Ghana was in charge of all the other ambassadors. And so as we got there in the dark of night. You can imagine that a nation undergoing this kind of stress did not have time for streetlights, so there were no streetlights. You could see absolutely nothing. But we arrived at night, and we arrived at the ambassador to Upper Volta, Burkina Faso's, his palace, his house. But when I say house, I really do mean palace. American ambassadors live in gracious kinds of ways. And so we arrived. We were staying at his house, and we arrived and had dinner. It was a scrumptious dinner that you would expect to receive in an ambassador's house. We slept there in well-appointed sleeping quarters, and then in the morning we got up. We ate breakfast again, another scrumptious meal. At that point, it was daytime, and we opened the door and we walked out into the street, going to walk a few blocks to where the American aid station was. Everything was dusty gray. The streets were dusty gray, even though they were paved. The buildings were dusty gray. The people were dusty gray, because this sand, this dust had spread over everything. And so I'm walking through this macabre scene, something I had never seen before in my mere 20 years, walking basically beside the ambassador to Burkina Faso. As I walk down the street, I'm looking, but I'm in awe. And there beside me is crawling a man. Now, this man looked like he may have been around 6 foot tall. I cannot tell because he could not stand. His skin looked thin, almost like a thin sheet of paper. It looked as though if I touched his skin, I would tear it. It would rip on his ribs, and you could see every rib in his body. His body was drawn and dry, and there was dust all over him. And it looked as though I could just pick him up and carry him under my arms. He weighed so little. My heart went out to him. And so I reached in my pocket as he was asking me to give him relief. I reached in my pocket to give him money, and then the ambassador to Burkina Faso grabbed my hand and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to give this man money. That's what we do." And he said, "Look around." And at that point, my eyes sort of opened up. And I looked around and I saw all the people. There were thousands of people, each one grayer than the other, dustier than the other. But they were standing. They were walking. They were trying to get to the aid station or find food. And he says to me, "If you give him money, you may feel good. You may make it when they attack us and they run after us to get more money. You'll probably outrun them, but he won't. And they will beat him and take the money, and he won't likely live through that beating." And so as I thought about it, as I looked in his face, I kept my hand in my pocket and I walked away. And yeah, even today, 50 years later, in moments of quiet, I can still see his face.